For a little while now I have been collecting these reprints of vintage sewing patterns. I decided that it was finally time to actually make one, and I chose this Butterick pattern from 1944. I had found this vintage rayon blend in a charity shop, which was a great match for the pattern as it had such a nice drape, plus the print was perfect for a 40s dress. I checked I had enough fabric to make this pattern in my size, and also checked the finished garment measurements so that I was sure the finished dress would fit. I then began tracing off the paper pattern pieces. I like to trace my pattern pieces rather than just cut them out, as I often make a lot of fit adjustments at this stage. Although for this dress, the only adjustment I made was to the bodice length. I took 3 centimeters out of the length and shorten line. Apart from that, I traced a size 12 for all the pieces and then cut out my paper pattern. I then cut my fabric out, matching the selvages of the fabric and smoothing and pinning the paper pattern pieces in place. I measure in from the selvage to make sure my patterns are on the straight of grain and then cut them out. Once all the pieces are cut, I always chalk on all the sewing lines. I know this takes a long time, but I like to be really precise in my sewing, and I honestly couldn't stitch in a straight line without them. I also make sure to transfer all the balance marks and notches, especially on the sleeves, so that I know which is the back and which is the front. I then use tailor's tacks to indicate all the balance marks and notches. I know I just chalk them on, but it's important to be able to see them from both sides of the fabric, and the chalk often rubs off after a little while. I then follow the instructions and begin sewing in the pleats on the front of the dress. I match the balance marks and sewing lines using a holding pin and then pin the 2 layers of fabric together. I pin in both pleats before threading up my machine and sewing the pleats in place. I then take the front panels to the ironing board and press the pleats from the wrong side and the right side. This fabric was very slippery, and it was at this moment I remembered that my sewing machine has a table attachment. This made it so much easier to sew. I then moved on to sewing the belt ties. I folded each tie in half lengthways and matched up the sewing lines. I was briefly distracted by the appearance of Winnie the adventure cat.
What you doing up there, Winnie?
But she was soon back on solid ground, and I stitched the ties, leaving one end open so I could turn them right sides out. I then graded the seam allowances to reduce bulk, clipping both the point and the corner. I then turned the ties right sides out and pressed. Unfortunately, the ironing board was really unstable and the footage came out all wobbly, so I've just had to make do with a few clips that turned out okay. Once pressed, I sewed the 2 lines of gathering stitches at the raw ends of each tie. I then gathered the ends of the tie up and pinned them to the front pieces, matching the balance marks. I then stitched the gathered ties in place. Next, I pinned the side front to the front by matching the balance marks up precisely and pinning in place. I then stitched this seam in place and repeated for the other side. I then ran 2 lines of gathering stitches between the balance marks on the front yoke edge. The instructions also said to then stay stitch the rest of the curved edge.
And see here, this balance mark needs to match to this balance mark. This balance mark needs to match to this balance mark. And then this section here of the main dress has to gather in, and this balance mark has to match there. And then these match up as well. So this is right sides up, and I need them right sides together. So I'm going to match everything up and then pin along this edge.
And so then more pinning. I know my painstaking method of pinning may seem a bit extra, but I did warn you that I like my sewing to be precise. Besides, when easing in 2 curves like now, it does make the whole thing a whole lot easier to sew in the end.
Strange that they made me stay stitch it, and now they're telling me to clip it where necessary.
So I carried on easing in the 2 curves, clipping through the nonsensical stay stitching I had just done. I then gathered up the front sections and evened out the gathers before pinning those in place. Then a boatload of pins later, I stitched the front and the yoke together. I then checked that I didn't have any tucks or puckers where I had eased the 2 curves in. I clipped the threads, clipped the curve, and then repeated for the other front section. From the inside there is then this raw edge that needs to be covered, and amazingly for a commercial sewing pattern, this is done with a hand-finished facing. The yoke facing piece is matched to the yoke and pinned in place at the armhole and shoulder before being tacked in place with a machine. The curved edge is then graded down, turned under to match the sewing line of the yoke, and pinned in place. I then hand stitched it down with a slant hemming stitch, which I have a separate tutorial on if you'd like to see the stitch in more detail. I then pressed the finished yoke and facing, and of course repeated these steps for the other side of the front. I then joined the two fronts together at the centre front seam. Well, I tried to stitch them together, but then my bobbin ran out, so I had to rewind the bobbin and try again. I then pressed the centre front seam open. With the fronts completed, I moved on to the back panels, pinning in the darts as I had done for the pleats on the front. When stitching in darts, I don't reverse at the beginning and end, instead I leave a long tail of thread and tie a knot. This reduces bulk and helps to create a smooth point to the dart. I then pressed the darts towards the centre back. I then decided that I wanted to neaten all the seams with pinking shears as the fabric was beginning to fray. I'm having a little bit of a dilemma here because I had originally intended to ignore what the instructions say. The instructions say that you should put a 24-inch zip in the centre back of the dress, but I hate that. I think they look really ugly and also they're really difficult to do up. So I had intended to instead put a shorter dress zip in the underarm seam. However, I've now realised that the neck is quite small on this dress. Hang on, let me show you on the line drawing. So you can see it's really closely fitted and I really doubt that I'm going to be able to get my head through there. So I don't really know what to do because I don't want a great big zip down the centre back of my dress, but I also want to be able to wear it. So I'm trying to think, can I don't know. I don't know what to do. I'll get back to you when I figured it out. So essentially what I decided to do was to lower the neckline at the centre front, creating a sort of slit in the centre front seam that I would be able to get my head through and then close up with a hook and eye. However, this was made more complicated by the neck facing and took a whole lot of experimenting and several failed attempts to figure out. In the end, I realised that I didn't need a zip at all, but I did need to create an opening at the centre back of the neck as well as the centre front. I stitched up the centre back and the shoulder seams, unpicked the centre front and then set about trying to make this new neck situation work with the existing facing pieces, which I realised at this moment needed interfacing. I've got my fusible interfacing pieces ready to go now, brilliant. However, I think what I'm going to do, I was listening to the Love to Sew podcast and one of their listeners had a tip for finishing the lower edge of your facing, and that is to, before you fuse it, actually bag it out. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to try that. I'm going to stitch. So these are right sides together. You can see it's the right side of the interfacing, that's the right side of the fabric. And then I'm going to stitch and essentially bag it out, trim all this down, and then fuse it together, and then I'll have a nice, neat edge to my facing, hopefully. Let's give it a go. I was really pleased with how well this worked and will definitely be using this technique again. Once I had fused the interfacing, I joined all the facing pieces together and set about trying to make it work with my altered neck situation. Okay, so we've had a bit of a change of plan. I have had to put a little opening in the back neck, but I'm avoiding doing a placket by just kind of facing it, and there'll be a sort of like keyhole opening. I might put a button and a loop there, or maybe just a hook and eye, because, hang on, I have to move the camera. Don't know if you can see here, I'd thought that this balance mark on the facing matched to this balance mark, but it doesn't. They just match to each other. So there's something funny happening at the front here, which I think I'm probably just gonna have to hand stitch up. So finally, after a lot of faffing, I attached the facing to the neckline with my extra front and back neck openings. I then clipped the corners and graded the seam allowances down so that I got a really crisp edge when I turned the facing to the inside of the neckline. I then understitched the facing by hand using a prick stitch. I also herringboned the facing in place at the shoulder seams. This stitch is great for areas where you still want a little bit of movement. With the neck complete, I pinned and joined the side seams, then neatened the raw edges with pinking shears and pressed the seams open. At this point, I tried the dress on to check the fit and to make sure Winnie liked it. I was really pleased with how well the dress had turned out, especially my strange neckline alteration, so I carried on with the sleeves. I adjusted the settings on my sewing machine and stitched 2 lines of gathering stitches between the balance marks on the sleeve head. Then, remembering to return my machine settings to normal, I pinned together the sleeve seams and stitched them in place. Then I did the usual pinking and pressing routine before measuring and pinning in place the sleeve hem. I had decided that to reduce bulk, I would just pink the raw edge of my hem and do a single fold. I then did a blind slip stitch to sew the hem in place. Then, to insert the sleeves to the dress, I lay the sleeve on the desk with the sleeve seam facing up and match the side seam of the dress to it. I then pin the armpit of the dress to the sleeve from the wrong side of the dress, working around until I reach the front and back balance marks. Once I reach the balance marks, I match the top sleeve head balance mark to the shoulder seam and pin in place from the wrong side of the sleeve. This is so that I can ease the gathers in a lot easier. I then pull on my gathering thread to gather up the sleeve head, adjust the sleeve head to the right length, and then wrap the gathering threads around a pin to hold them in place. I then evenly distribute the gathers and pin them in place. Then, once I've removed the table attachment, I stitch the armpit of the sleeve first, starting at the front balance mark and with the wrong side of the dress facing up. Once I get to the back balance mark, I reverse and take the dress out from under the machine. I then turn the dress around and go back to the front balance mark, stitching with the wrong side of the sleeve facing up. This way I can stroke the gathers and ease them in as I sew. I stitch very slowly, making sure that I am not catching anything I shouldn't. When I get back around to the back balance mark, I reverse and cut my threads. This method makes it so much easier to sew in sleeves and almost always stops you getting those puckers and catches that happen so often with sleeves. After briefly celebrating the success of my first sleeve, I repeated all that again for the other sleeve before neatening the edges and steaming the sleeves over a tailor's ham. My next challenge was the hem. As this dress has diagonal or bias seams, I put the dress on my dress form and left the hem to hang overnight. The next morning, I used this random metal thing I found in my brother's conservatory to level the hem. I measured how far off the floor I wanted the finished hem to be and then put a mark on my makeshift tool and folded the hem under at that mark. I'm really glad I left the hem to hang, as in some places the hem was double what it should have been. I evened everything up and trimmed it down with my pinking shears before pressing the fold in place. As this fabric was so slippery, I added some pins to the hem fold to help it stay in place as I stitched. I then decided, before hand sewing the hem, to tackle the shoulder pads. I found the centre, matched this to the shoulder seam, and matched the edge of the shoulder pad to the edge of the sleeve seam allowance. I hand stitched it in place with a fairly long running stitch and caught it down at the neck with a few ladder stitches. I also procrastinated stitching the hem by adding the hooks and eyes at the back and front neck openings. And when the hem could be put off no longer, I used a blind slip stitch to carefully hand stitch the hem in place. The slippery synthetic nature of this fabric made it a really horrible experience. But then finally the dress was finished. I got all dressed up and did my hair to look like the illustration on the pattern envelope. This had to happen after I'd put the dress on, of course, because of the tight neckline. But I'm really pleased with how the dress turned out. I love the details of the yoke on the front and the really strong silhouette of the shoulders. I do think it is possibly a bit big on the bust for me, but I'm kind of okay with the more relaxed feel this creates. Most importantly, I checked what Winnie the Adventure Cat thought of it, and she definitely approved. However, Sergeant Tibbs did not. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.